After World War I, most of the nations of Europe were in a very serious situation in terms of finances and in terms of manpower. Millions of people had been killed during the war. Billions of dollars had been spent on the war. Even more billions of dollars worth of property had been damaged one way or another through the war. There were tremendous social readjustments, tremendous amount of relocation of peoples who had been moved about by the war. The next 2 decades of Europe, from the teens into the 1930s, were a major time of realignment. Politically speaking, it was a very chaotic period in European history. 4 major empires were dissolved by the war: the Turkish Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, as well as the Russian Empire. The government in all 4 of these areas collapsed because of the pressures of the war, all of them, of course, being involved in the war. Adding to the chaos of this entire situation was the victory of the Bolsheviks, the communists in Russia, in 1917, and the takeover of the entire Russian governmental situation by the communists. The victory of the communists in Russia then was a spur and encouragement to the hopes of socialists and communists in other countries as well. As a result, socialist parties agitated for their position within the government in a variety of European countries, particularly in Central Europe. There were strikes, and there were street demonstrations, and there were riots in many of the countries throughout Europe. The result of all of this, the rise of socialism and communism, was a very fearsome thing to the middle classes that owned property, because they saw the possibility, as had recently happened in Russia when the communists took over, all private property is now taken over by the state. And the middle classes in many of the nations of Europe now became fearful for their own property and their future way of life. The result is to move the middle classes from the left side of the spectrum toward more liberty and freedom and political equality, moving them more to the right, to a more conservative political situation, because they did not trust where the leftist, socialist, and communist parties were going. This was also particularly true in Italy. In Italy, there were socialist strikes in the northern part of the country, which is the more industrialized part of the country. Southern Italy is much more agrarian and pastoral. Most of the industry of Italy is in the northern area. And in this area, there were various sit-down strikes led by the workers. Some factories were simply seized and taken over by the workers. Confiscation of property in the name of the state. This was becoming very, very common. Again, a tremendous amount of political and economic chaos in Italy at the time. And that's why when Benito Mussolini organized the Fascist Party, many of the propertied middle-class people saw Mussolini and the fascists as a defense against communism, against these confiscations in the name of the state, against the removal of private property. In October of 1922, Mussolini received official permission for his political party, the Fascists, or as they were often called, the Black Shirts, because of the black shirt that they normally wore. Mussolini, in October of 1922, received official permission for a march on Rome to demonstrate their particular power and to indicate their displeasure with the way things were going in the Italian government. Many people thought that when they marched on Rome, there might be a complete military takeover of the government, and the Black Shirts would in fact stage a military revolution and overthrow of the government. Actually, they did not have that in mind. All they had in mind was a demonstration of concern and, in fact, a demonstration of power. But because of the concern on what the fascists might result in, the cabinet of the prime minister resigned, and the king of Italy had no choice but to appoint a new government, to appoint a new premier. And he appointed Mussolini premier of Italy, which put the fascists in power in 1922. Now, it's important to note, all of this is done legally and constitutionally. There were certainly some innuendos behind the scenes about possible power confrontations, but Mussolini came to power in Italy strictly by legal and constitutional means. However, once the fascists were in power, once the fascists were in power, Mussolini took over the parliament and abolished all other political parties. He established a secret police, and that led to a military dictatorship. He destroyed all of the labor unions. Labor unions are normally identified with the leftist view of things. Power to the people as opposed to the power of management and capital. Mussolini destroyed the labor unions. He prohibited the right to strike. And the fascists will remain as the only political party left in Italy, which of course is exactly what they wanted. Now, it's important to notice at the time, the Pope, Pius XI, who had just come into office that very same year, 1922. Pius XI had just returned from a trip through Poland. He had seen the fighting going on between the Republic of Poland and the communist armies of Russia. He had seen the conflict and the confrontation and the death and the destruction. He had seen the vandalism created by the communist armies. He had seen the political chaos that was identified with communism. He had seen the confiscation of private property and the murder of middle-class people who were identified with capitalism. Pope Pius XI will return to Italy totally afraid of what communism represented. And therefore he saw the fascists as a necessary defense to protect the church from these communist atheists whom he saw as a severe threat to the way of life of the Western countries and certainly the way of life of the Roman Catholic Church. And therefore Pius XI, firmly opposed to communism, supported Mussolini in all of the developments in these early years because he felt it was necessary for the fascists to be an umbrella of protection over the church to save private property and to save Catholicism from communist and socialist takeover. That's one reason why in 1929 Pius XI signed the Lateran Pact, a treaty between the papacy and Italy that finally formalizes political relationships between the two. As I mentioned in our last presentation, Pius IX refused to accept the reality of the new Kingdom of Italy. He went into the Vatican and called himself the prisoner of the Vatican and never came out after Rome was taken over by the Italian troops. And the same kind of policy will be continued by later popes until 1929, when Pius XI finally resolves that issue. They acknowledged Italy as the legitimate government of the territory. They allowed Catholics to participate freely in Italian politics, which had been prohibited previously. And in turn, Catholicism was regarded as the official religion of the state for Italy. And the papacy was given possession of Vatican City. All that's left of the Papal States is this one relatively small territory on the northwest side of Rome. And Vatican City and a few other small palaces scattered around is all that's left of actual real estate owned directly by the Pope. But what all this represents is the papacy and Roman Catholicism has officially endorsed the fascists because they see them as a necessary defense against the communists. In another provision of the Lateran Pact on the part of the Italian government was to recognize the freedom of Catholic action groups. This is really a series of organizations operated by the Catholic Church, a series of organizations by laity to carry on the work of the Catholic Church in various educational ways and benevolent ways and a number of other activities. Lateran Pact gave freedom to Catholic action as long as its activities were non-political. Now, the problem with that is who determines what is non-political, or what is, on the other hand, political? And that soon turned out to be a very key part of the agreement, because within a year, Mussolini is now interfering with the activities of Catholic action, particularly in the area of education and youth work. Pius protested and claimed these restrictions against the freedom of Catholic action were absurd. And he condemned any regime which tended toward a pagan worship of the state. But he didn't really name names. It was obvious he was referring to fascism and the Italian government, but he didn't name the fascist state or Mussolini or the Italians in particular. On their side, the Italian government saw education as a political activity, because in fact education means training the next generation of voters, and there are some significant political implications of that. And they did not want the Catholic Church to train young people in such a way that they might vote against some of the principles of the fascists. And so therefore education now becomes a political activity. Youth work becomes a political activity because, again, you are training the mind, you are shaping the morals and the values of the next generation of voters. Now, of course, by that definition, almost anything can be called political. And what that means is that ultimately, yes, the fascist government would take over every element of life, because in order to preserve itself, it had to control every element of life. And yet, in spite of all the friction that's developing between the papacy and the fascist government, still, when the Italian government declared war on Ethiopia in 1935, the Italians, using a very mechanized army with airplanes and tanks and machine guns, and they attacked tribal people who were still using rifles and camels and all the rest of that. When the Italians gained an easy victory in their war against Ethiopia, the Pope called the Italian victory a contribution to world peace, even though the League of Nations had branded this war as an illegal act of aggression on a defenseless nation, and had imposed trade sanctions, commercial restrictions upon Italy because of its aggression in Ethiopia. And so the League of Nations saw this as illegal aggression, but the papacy was unwilling to condemn Italy because of this and simply called it a contribution to world peace. By the way, it's because of many of those trade sanctions and the restriction of many commercial goods coming into Italy, Italy soon begins to feel the commercial pinch of all of that. And another individual who is ruling a country to the north of Italy, Adolf Hitler, and we'll come back to him in a little bit, Adolf Hitler agreed to supply many of the commercial products that the League of Nations was cutting off. That will lead to a tremendous agreement between Mussolini and Hitler, and will lead to the establishment of the Axis powers, the Rome-Berlin Axis, and of course ultimately that will be very much a part of the way World War II develops, and why the Italians and the Germans will fight together, partially because of the economic repercussions of the sanctions of the League of Nations against Italy. Now, we've talked about Italy and the movement of the church there in order to defend itself, its existence, and its private property. The Catholic Church moves in a defense of a rightist government, a fascist military dictatorship, in order to preserve itself. What has happened in Italy is soon happening in other countries as well. Much the same thing will happen in Portugal. Portugal had established a republic in 1910. It had disestablished the church, that is, removed the state-church relationship in 1911. Yet in the 1920s, a World War I military hero led a military overthrow of the Republican government in Portugal, established a new government, a new constitution modeled after fascist Italy. And so what happens in Italy will soon become the pattern for what happens in Portugal as well. Things are even more chaotic in Spain. There was a Republican government and then a military takeover in 1923. The military government was thrown out in 1930. In 1931, elections led to a Republican government. And in the Spanish situation, Republican normally means socialist and communist. That is more leftist than a rightist militarist regime. With the result that by the spring of 1936, the leftist government in Spain had taken a strongly anti-church position. In addition, it was seizing land, taking over private property, closing down opposition newspapers, encouraging industrial strikes against industry owners. That's why in July of 1936 there was another military revolution. This will lead into what we refer to as the Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939. The leader of that development in Spain is General Francisco Franco, a very devout Catholic. It will be a very hard-fought battle for the next 3 years, but ultimately the rightist forces of military control will defeat the Republican forces in Spain and establish a military government in Spain, and Francisco Franco will rule the country until his death in 1975, almost 40 years later. And the result in Spain is, again, the establishment of a strongly militarist government defending the church, identifying with the church, and the church will see all of this as a necessary protection against socialist and communist threat. It's interesting that in 1937, the bishops of Spain called this military revolution a crusade to defend the church against the infidel threats of the socialists and the communists. Now, what we're seeing here is a fairly consistent pattern in three very important Catholic countries, in Italy, in Portugal, and in Spain, and the pattern will be the same. Leftist developments which will terrorize the middle classes and move them toward a more rightist, militarist position in alliance with the church and establishing a fascist government to defend private property and to maintain the privileges of the Catholic Church. Much the same thing will happen to the north of the Alps up in Germany. There, the pattern is much the same, although it will vary just a little bit. In Germany, the Catholic Church has its own political party. This was developed during the establishment of the Second German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm I. The Catholic Party is known as the Center Party because in the Reichstag, the German government, the parties of the right, the militarist and monarchical royalist parties, sat on one end. The leftist parties, the socialists and the communists, sat on the other end of the Reichstag, and the Catholic Party sat in the middle. Now, depending upon the election and who was voted and who was voted out and who was voted in, that would influence how many people sat on the left, how many people sat on the right, and exactly how many people are left to sit in the center. The Catholic Party often joined with one of the other two groups, depending upon who promised it the most. There is a tremendous amount of political instability in Germany during these years. After World War I, a republic was established in Weimar. It's called the Weimar Republic. That republic will last 15 years, from 1918 to 1933. But during those years, the Catholic Center Party was constantly moving in various political coalitions from one group to another. If the leftists were in power, then the Catholics would start talking to the parties of the right, saying, well, now what will you give us if we help you come into power? And if they got sufficient promises from them, then the Catholics would swing their support to the right, and they would then become the dominant majority. And then once they were in power, if the Catholics weren't getting enough to please them, they would start talking to the parties of the left. What will you give us if we help you come into power? In the process of this, the Catholics changed sides 12 times in 15 years. That's why there is a tremendous amount of political instability in Germany from 1918 to 1933. And that political instability is exactly the reason why Adolf Hitler, the leader of the National Socialist Party, a party of the left, well, actually a party of the right, because the emphasis is on nationalism in spite of the word socialism, but it's a rightist party, emphasizing military preparedness and military responses. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, or the National Socialists, would take advantage of this tremendous political instability, and in 1933, Hitler was invited by the President of Germany to establish a new government and be established in power. That is the beginning of the Nazi takeover of Germany. Again, let me emphasize, Hitler came to power using legal and constitutional means, at least officially. Now, unofficially, he often used brutal tactics. He had people that would beat up other political opponents on the streets, and there were a number of relatively illegal things going on the streets of Germany during this time. But as far as the government is concerned, Hitler comes to power because he was officially asked to appoint a new government under the president. The Nazis come into power in 1933. That very same year, the Pope signed a concordat with the Nazis, acknowledging the Nazis as the official government of Germany and making agreements on how the Nazis and the Catholics would cooperate in the government of Germany. One of the first things the Pope agreed to was to dissolve the Center Party. The Catholics had a political party. They now dissolved it, which means the only political party that is legally allowed in Germany is, of course, the Nazis. And they now are going to run roughshod over the entire situation. And then once Hitler is in power, he does much the same thing that Mussolini had done some 11 years previously. He got there by constitutional means. But now he begins to harass and pull back on the agreements he had made with the Catholic organizations. Catholic labor organizations were coming under pressure. Catholic newspapers are being closed down. By 1935, the Nazis are trying to force indoctrination in Catholic schools. Nazis accused the monasteries of smuggling currency and rampant homosexuality in their monasteries. Now, neither of these things were true, but he was bringing up these accusations in order to destroy their support among the people, eliminate the power bases of Catholicism so that nobody will be in a position to question him. Again, Pope Pius XI protested what he saw as a violation of the terms of the Concordat of 1933. In fact, at this point, the Pope called Nazism fundamentally unchristian. But there was nothing he could do about it at this time. The Nazis are firmly in power. Pius XI is becoming an old man. He did not have the energy to do much, and there probably weren't any realistic alternatives that were available to him. Pius XI was becoming tremendously disillusioned with the fascists. Initially, the Catholics saw the fascists as a necessary defense against communism. They have only recently discovered the fascists can be just as brutal, just as oppressive as the communists ever promised to be. When Pius XI died in 1939, he died a very broken and disappointed man. The policies he had developed to help protect the church had become measures of persecuting and harassing the church. And Catholicism will suffer severely under all of these fascist regimes. Pius XII, when he came to power in 1939, would try to reorient things toward the Western democracies. But it was too late, because when we start talking about 1939, in September of that year, that's when World War II began. And it was too late to try to change things. Europe will be in a situation of war for the next 6 years. Now, Hitler in Germany did more than just pick on the Catholics. In the other 3 countries we talked about, Catholicism is the basic religion, because in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, Catholicism is pretty much all there is. But in Germany, Protestantism is very strong as well. And Hitler was doing much the same thing to the Protestants as he was already doing to the Catholics, particularly to the Lutherans. But even, well, just all the Protestants there in Germany. By 1932, that is the year before he was officially put in office as Chancellor of Germany, in 1932, the Nazis had organized a group called the German Christians. Now, the emphasis in that phrase is on the word German, not on Christian. They are certainly much more Nazi than they are Christian in orientation. For instance, membership in this group is limited to those of pure German descent. Anyone with 1/8 Jewish background was prohibited from being a member, and anyone with Slavic background was prohibited from being a member. Only those of at least more than 7/8 Germanic ancestry could be a member of the German Christians. That's why it's much more German than it is Christian. It's very racist in orientation. The German Christians denounced communism, and they sought to parallel the church to National Socialism, that is, bring the organized churches more firmly into the program and the agenda of the Nazis. By 1934, the German Christians tried to place their candidate as the head of the German Church Federation, directing all of the churches throughout Germany and hoping to swing all of them or tie all of them into a Nazi direction. This particular individual, who's installed as the head of the German Church Federation, wanted to prohibit all persons of Jewish ancestry from being clergy, just on a matter of race and bloodline. Anyone who was opposed to the Nazis was also to be prohibited from being clergy. He also wanted to purify the New Testament by removing all phrases that had a Jewish origin. Phrases like amen, terms like hallelujah. These are Hebrew terms, and therefore were unacceptable to the Nazis. The New Testament, they tried to rewrite the New Testament in order to clarify the German ancestry of Jesus. Now, you might find that a little bit surprising, but their explanation was Jesus was not born of the Virgin Mary. Jesus was certainly born of Mary, but she was not a virgin. The father of Jesus was actually a mercenary German soldier serving in the Roman army who happened to be in Palestine at the time. Now, there is absolutely no evidence of that. There are no German mercenaries in the Roman army at this particular time. This is entirely a figment of the Nazi imagination. But they felt it's better to have Jesus half German than completely Jew, even if being completely Jew means he's virgin born. Better to be an illegitimate half German than to be a virgin born Jew. Now, many of the Christians in Germany, Protestant Christians, were totally offended by all of this. In 1934, there was a movement underway to resist these developments. They become known as the Confessing Church. confessing the purity of Christianity and maintaining Christianity against the Nazi ideology. Martin Niemöller, a World War I submarine captain who became quite a major political hero after World War I. In the meantime, Martin Niemöller had become a Lutheran clergyman and was preaching at a church in Berlin. But because of his resistance to the Nazis, he was arrested in 1937. He was put on trial for his crimes of resisting the government. To his surprise, and the surprise of almost everybody else, he was acquitted by the courts. But he was not allowed to be a free man. Before he left the court building, he was arrested by the Gestapo as the personal prisoner of Adolf Hitler and immediately sent to a concentration camp where he stayed throughout the remainder of those years and throughout World War II. That is just one example of the kind of political oppression to any of the clergy in Germany who were resisting the Nazi takeover. At one time, during this period, it is estimated there are 15,000 pastors in Germany. 7,000 of them were members of the Confessing Church. That is, almost half the German clergy joined the Confessing Church in spite of great political risk and personal danger to themselves and their families. Karl Barth was teaching theology in Germany at the time. Karl Barth was a Swiss. He was not German. But he resisted the Nazi regime, and because of that, because he's not German, he was kicked out of the country. And Karl Barth would spend all the years of World War II back in his homeland of Switzerland. The Hitler Youth Movement tried to infiltrate youth meetings in the churches or hold alternative meetings at the very same time that the churches were holding youth meetings to lure young people away from the churches and bring them more fully into Nazi ideology. Once World War II got underway, the Nazis continued their pressure upon the resisting Christians of Germany. It is estimated that during the war, of all of those 7,000 pastors in the Confessing Church, 85% of them were drafted into the German army. Now, to be a pastor automatically means in Germany a person has a college education. Normally, people with college education become officers in the armed forces. That is not true of the German pastors. All of them were put into the army as privates in infantry divisions and were put at the front lines. It is obvious the purpose was to get them as close to the fighting as possible and hopefully have as many of them killed as possible in the name of defending the country. Many German pastors protested the teachings of Nazis which led to immorality, such as euthanasia for the elderly, the infirm, those who were mentally deficient, and as a result, many of them were put in concentration camps or eliminated. Many of the pastors went through this kind of experience. There was little protest against the Holocaust because actually very few of the German people actually understood what was going on. They knew the Jews were being taken away. It is very controversial even today how much the actual German people knew about the death camps and the gas ovens and all the rest of that. The Pope at the time, Pius XII, it's extremely controversial even today as to how much information he had. Some say he knew very well what was going on and he chose to do nothing. Others say, well, he really didn't have very good information and there wasn't anything he could do. Some of the more modern defenses of Pius XII are there wasn't anything he could do because if he tried to issue a protest, the Nazis would simply arrest and execute more Catholics. And so he did nothing in Germany to preserve the Jews because he felt he had no options. It is true that in Rome, he allowed thousands of Jews to seek sanctuary in Vatican City, and he did preserve the lives of thousands of Jews in central Italy. But apparently he made no step to defend the Jews in Germany. And of course, approximately 6 million Jews were executed during World War II. Martin Niemöller, the person I referred to previously, who was arrested and then spent the war as the personal prisoner of Hitler in a concentration camp, after the war was over and Niemöller survived, and he returned to his preaching ministry in Berlin and became internationally famous for his preaching and for his commitment to the cause of Christ. Martin Niemöller made an interesting observation after the war was all over. He was talking about the fact that there was so little opportunity, or at least so little protest, against what the Nazis were doing. And Martin Niemöller put it this way: when the Nazis came for the communists, we did not protest because we were not communists. When they came for the labor organizers, we did not protest because we were not labor organizers. When the Nazis came for the Jews, we did not protest because we were not Jews. When the Nazis came for the Catholics, we did not protest because we were not Catholics. And when they came for us, there was no one left to protest. And Niemöller admitted they had made a major tactical mistake. The Christian leaders of Germany should have, and of course it's a whole lot easier to judge things years later, but Niemöller said the Christian leaders of Germany should have made a point of standing up, defending our rights, resisting the oppression of the Nazis, and perhaps we could have stopped a great deal of this before it all got started. But the fact is, they didn't. And many scholars point out that is one of the major reasons why, after World War II, church attendance and church involvement throughout much of Europe went drastically downhill. In much of Europe today, church attendance only runs about 4 or 5% of the entire population, even in countries that still have official state churches. And why? Because for many of the people, in a time of moral crisis, the churches failed them and did not provide effective leadership. This was a time of moral and spiritual bankruptcy. And when the churches should have stepped in and provided direction and guidance, the churches looked to their own selfish interests, the continuation of their own property, what was best for them personally, did not step out, did not put themselves at risk, and thus the entire society suffered. And as a result, many people throughout Europe lost confidence in organized Christianity. And the church attendance in much of Europe today is probably the lowest it has ever been, until we go all the way back to the days of the Roman Empire. All because the church leaders failed to provide adequate moral and spiritual leadership for the people. And perhaps there's a lesson there even for us today. It is our obligation as Christian leaders to stand up for what is right and to defend people's rights and privileges and religious attitudes. And it is our obligation to provide moral and spiritual leadership even in our generation, or the next generation may feel that we have failed in the same way and we have contributed to a moral and spiritual bankruptcy. The church today faces some significant opportunities and also some major obligations to maintain an effective witness for the cause of Christ.